Everyone for joining us today for the Bobwhite Quail Lunch and Learn. I'm Lisa Lord. I'm the Conservation Programs Director with the Longleaf Alliance, and I manage several of our wildlife conservation and recovery initiatives in several states, and then also provide outreach for the Sewee Longleaf Conservation Cooperative, which is hosting this webinar today along with the Longleaf Alliance and our other partners. I really appreciate everyone joining us for this hour, for this facilitated discussion. I think this will be an engaging conversation about one of landowners' favorite wildlife species, Bobwhite quail. We have a really knowledgeable panel today. I'm here to answer your questions, and I'll introduce them to you in just a minute. I also want to say thank you to our grant funders, the National Fish and Wildlife Foundation, NRCS, and International Paper through their Forest Land Stewards program, and also to our panelists from DNR and Clemson for their support. I'll be moderating the panel again today, and then Parker Johnson, Forestry and Wildlife Agent with Clemson, is our tech guru, and he'll be helping to monitor the chat box and send some questions our way. Oh, I think I'm on mute. So your cameras and your microphones are off today, but we want this to be an interactive experience. So I really encourage you to use the chat box to ask questions and leave comments, but just try to stay on topic if you can, so we can find those questions. There will be an optional evaluation at the end of the webinar today, so I'd really appreciate it if you could stick around and fill that out. It should just take you about 2 minutes, but it will help us create better content going forward today. So I wanted to take just a minute or so to tell you about the Sewee Longleaf Conservation Cooperative. It was formed in 2012. It's one of 18 longleaf implementation teams across the southeastern range of longleaf pine, and it's one of 3 longleaf teams here in South Carolina. And essentially, it's a private-public partnership of folks working together to accomplish longleaf pine restoration on the ground. The SLCC works in 4 counties: Charleston, Berkeley, Williamsburg, and Georgetown. The LIT does have a website, which I've put up there on the screen. And if you need more information, feel free to contact Patrick Ma, who is the coordinator for the LIT with the Nature Conservancy, or me. And we also have a cost share available for landowners interested in restoring longleaf. So this is what you've been waiting for, is our panel, and we have really a wealth of experience on our panel today. This is kind of the South Carolina Dream Team. We appreciate our partners from DNR and Clemson and the Bobwhite Quail Initiative that have agreed to come on today. So I'm going to kind of go down the line here, starting with Michael, and have each of the panelists introduce themselves. So if you could just kind of tell us your name, your title, who you work for, and what you do in your role. So Michael, I'll kick it off to you.
Hey there, I'm Michael Hook. I'm the Small Game Program Coordinator for the state. I've worked in this position for about 5 years. I've been with the DNR for close to 20 now. But I help manage all the small game in South Carolina. That's our big projects are dove and quail, but we also help out with grouse, woodcock, rabbits, squirrels. Like I said, we focus a lot on quail.
Great, thank you. TJ?
Good afternoon, I'm TJ Savarino. I am a forestry and wildlife extension agent with Clemson Extension since 2016, although I've worked for Extension since 2003. I cover 5 counties in the, I guess you'd consider, inland PD region. My home county is Lee County, and I assist landowners with all kinds of things, like, what is this snake I just chopped into a dozen different pieces? What is this spider, how do I get rid of these weeds in my pond? That's a real big thing this time of year. But when I get to do it's habitat restoration I'm really interested in, primarily longleaf pine and native grasslands, pollinator habitat. And so I consider myself lucky when I get calls about those issues.
Thank you, TJ. Breck?
Hello, Breck Carmichael with the Department of Natural Resources. I've been with the agency for 35 years and been in various positions. Right now, I'm working strictly on the South Carolina Bobwhite Initiative, which is our statewide quail habitat restoration program. So happy to be here.
Thank you. Cory?
Hey, I'm Cory Heaton with Clemson University. I'm the state wildlife specialist, and getting older. This year makes 21 years of working in the field of wildlife, and most of that time's been devoted to quail and deer. And in the past few years, we've added in a lot of agriculture components to that, but looking at ways to farm and still have the wildlife we want, make it all work together. I'm happy to be here today.
Thank you. And Andy?
I'm Andy Krieg. I'm a farm bill quail biologist. I cover about half the state, and if anybody is interested in possibly managing private lands for quail, I'd be happy to meet with them and lay out some of their opportunities, especially if they're interested in cost share. That's what I'm based out of a USDA office and fairly knowledgeable about some of the USDA programs. So.
Great, thank you. All right, let me stop sharing my screen here so that you can see everybody. All right, so we have a set of questions that we'll start with that people sent in, and then we'll take some of your questions from the chat. So as things come to mind, feel free to go ahead and ask those questions. So, to kind of start with, if a landowner is interested in managing for bobwhite quail and they're a new landowner, how would you sort of suggest that they get started? And we'll start with you, Michael.
I'd talk to everybody I could. There's a lot of experts around the state, and there's a lot of free advice that can be given. DNR's got folks that'll come out, and like say Andy and Dan are two of our employees that do just that. They go out, help folks, give them technical advice. They actually help find some financial assistance as well. We've got 2 quail forever biologists in the state that do very similar work. You've got the Forestry Commission that has stewardship foresters. You've got Clemson extension agents. NRCS has got district conservationists and biologists. I mean, there's a wealth of knowledge out there, and it's all free, and you just got to call. And usually I tell folks, call everybody, get everybody to come out and give you their opinion, and then formulate your own plan. You can pick and choose from what everybody says and come up with a pretty decent plan.
Great, thank you. TJ, do you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, I would add to have realistic goals in mind. I think you have to be familiar with what you have on your property, how many acres you have. Unfortunately, if you only have 4 or 5 acres, unless you're adjoining other landowners that have more acreage, enough to sustain a bobwhite quail population, there's little that you can do to hope to attract quail to your property. But we'll get into a little more of those details later, but be familiar with the habitat needs of quail and their basic biology, and kind of keep that in perspective when you're evaluating your land and how much you can actually do.
Breck?
Yeah, I would just echo what Michael said. There's a lot of folks out there that can help, and it's really important to have a plan, have objectives, and know where you're trying to go. There's also any number of consultants, wildlife consultants out there. Of course, they're going to charge you something for their services, but the benefit to them is they can probably do a little more than most of us agency folks are in terms of follow up, and also maybe even, you know, help you get the work done on the ground. They know a lot of contractors and so forth. So take advantage of all the knowledge you can.
Thank you. Cory, any advice for new landowners?
Definitely, and it kind of falls into play with what everybody else has said, but you know, ultimately the first step is to inventory what you got, you know, whether you're working with a consultant or going at your own. But if you're going to develop quail habitat, you got to know what you got going into it and what's going to be required to move from there to where we want to be at. So, you know, that initial inventory of what's available and what can be manipulated into quail habitat, that's pretty important to getting started.
Yeah, great comments. Andy?
I would like to just concur with everybody else that's on the panel, but just remind landowners to look at a landscape level. A lot of times I meet with landowners and they're just interested in their 20 or 40 acres, but it's really about what's going on around you. You're surrounded by closed canopy plantation pine. You're in the hole. It's going to take a lot of work to get any birds on your property. So.
Yeah, great point about sort of thinking outside of just your property. So what would each of you kind of consider ideal bobwhite quail habitat? Is there a certain mix of habitats or a particular habitat structure that you would recommend? And Michael, we can start with you again.
Yeah, so bobwhites, they need at least three, maybe four different things. They need brood cover, they need nesting cover, escape cover, and bare ground is a pretty big component. You know, everybody thinks of bobwhites being a grassland bird, but they're really a shrub bird. And like I say, just that big weedy mess is what they're looking for.
TJ, you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, well, you know, often you'll hear it referred to as the rule of thirds: third of native grasses, third forbs and lagoons, and a third of scrubby habitat for escape cover. And then the fourth element, as Michael said, is that making sure you have that bare ground underneath where the quail can move and find seeds and insects. If you have a lot of thatch built up, then you need to do some burning or some other type of disturbance, maybe disking at the appropriate time of year. But yeah, a lot of people think of them as being a pine species, but they don't necessarily require pines. But pines make it a lot easier to burn sometimes if you don't have the grasses. But those three, the rule of thirds is the key to keep in mind, and then add in that bare ground.
Great, thank you. How about you, Breck?
I can't add much to what they've said other than, you know, you have to be sure that all those components are well interspersed with one another. Quail are not very mobile compared to a lot of species, and so they need all of their habitat requirements in close proximity to one another so that they're not having to move very much to get what they need. So that takes a little planning.
It certainly does. How about you, Cory? Any thoughts on habitat?
Yeah, I'm gonna continue on with what Breck just brought up. You can have the greatest habitat in the world, but if it's not connected to other habitat, it kind of turns into a sink rather than a source for quail. So it's really important that all these habitat components are connected to each other. And not only that we're connecting these habitat components at a landscape level, you know, moving over to your neighbor's place and connecting to their habitat, and that neighbor connecting to the next. So connectivity is a big part of this.
Yeah, it sounds like it would be important for landowners to get to know their neighbors then, and maybe join up with similar management techniques. Andy?
I can't just beat the dead horse kind of, but adjacency and like you said, knowing your landowners are your neighbors, and possibly creating a co-op and you know, trying to get together and do things together instead of like things like burning. You know, it's always good if you're burning by yourself to have help, and you may be able to work with your neighbors to, you know, work together to get that burning done. So.
Yeah. So management changes throughout the year. You know, I work in the longleaf world, and we sort of go from planting season to burning season and then shift into other things. So what are the things that landowners need to be thinking about now this time of year on their property for quail? Andy, we can start with you and then we'll kind of work backwards.
You can still burn. We recommend stop our growing season burns around May 15th in the spring. But right now you can still be burning, especially if you have some hardwood encroachment. It's a really good time that you could, if you get fire, get a low humidity day and get some fire on the ground, you can get really good control of some of that sweet gum and possibly other unwanted oaks in other areas. But some other things you could be doing, if you really, really wanted to, you could, this is way down the line, but you could possibly getting ready to plant things like sorghum and you could be doing your feed lines, but that's way far down the line. We don't want to concentrate on that. We want to get every other aspect of habitat correct before we worry about food plots and feed lines and things of that sort.
Okay.
A lot of the things that we want to concentrate on are in the cool season as far as bobwhite management. So.
Okay, good. Cory, any thoughts on that, on what landowners really need to be kind of thinking about this time of year?
Ideally, we're focusing right now on making sure that habitat is intact and that we have what we need to get into the nesting season, which is fixing to get started. So, double checking all that stuff. And like Andy said, if you're one of those that really likes to plant food plots, it's prime time for sorghum to go in the ground right now. You can plant a lot of the millets now if you're interested in doing that. We're a little later than I would like to plant if we were going to be looking at some of our native species, but it can be done this time of year. And in fact, if you're like me right now, you don't have a choice but to replant because spring has been way drier than it should have been. And everything that we've planted in the native range that germinated got hit by that late frost. So, we took a big hit on native warm season plants this year. So normally I wouldn't tell you to plant native warm season plants in May, but this year, May, there's going to be some warm season plants that go into the ground.
Yeah, I think most of us in the state are kind of feeling the pain from this dry weather that we've been having. It's impacted a lot of different activities. Breck, do you have anything else to add to that?
Yeah, this is a good time of year to start gearing up to control, introduce warm season grasses. If you have any on your property, Bermuda, Bahia, those types of species are extremely unfavorable for quail because they just provide such a thick turf-like environment that bobwhites, especially young bobwhites, have trouble moving through it, and they actually will just totally avoid those kind of areas. So if you have Bermuda or Bahia, you need to figure out a way to get rid of it, and it's starting to grow rapidly now and would be very susceptible to herbicide application right now. Mm-hmm. Then the other thing would be maybe you've got some areas that are very thick with hardwood sprouts and sweet gum, and the fires have not been able to control them. You could go in there with some kind of mechanical treatment right now, like mastication, and just kind of grind them down to the ground. And then when they sprout back, hit them with a herbicide later this summer.
Okay. TJ?
That's a great point. There's you can be doing invasive species control, depending on the species. There's something you can be doing all year round, but right now is a good time to identify your invasive plants that you want to get under control. In addition to the turf grasses that Breck mentioned, you have Johnson grass or other things as plants are actively growing. Probably if you didn't get the rain, a little bit of rain we got yesterday, you probably want to hold off because a lot of those plants, they're not, if they're drought stressed, they won't take up the chemical that well. Another thing to do would be if you don't want to try to get any burning in before May 15th, you can do growing season burns in the later part of the year too, before the plants shut down, but before they mobilize those nutrients that they've created and take them back into the roots before they go dormant. You can do some burns in late summer or early fall before the plants shut down, and the quail have already nested by then. And So keep in mind that fall season. I haven't done a lot of that type of burning myself, but I know they use it a lot on some of the Heritage Trust Preserve properties. So those are a couple of things.
Great. And Michael, I'll kind of let you wrap this question up.
One of my favorite things to do this time of year is to put up the bush hog. I'm sort of famous for cussing about folks mowing down their quail habitat this time of year. It gets tempting to go out there, tidy up the farm. They see that big weedy mess. They can't stand it, and they got to just get out and mow it down. So just be purposeful about, bush hogging around your farm. I understand that you got to do some roads and clean up every now and then, but just those little strips of weedy, messy areas, they go a long way for quail. And like I said, that's one of the best pieces of advice I can give is put up the bush hog.
Yeah, many of our wildlife species like it messy. You can clean your house, but maybe don't clean the woods. So it looks like we've got a couple questions in the chat, and some things that you all said piqued folks' interest on connectivity and landscape scale line of thinking, but also what is the minimum acreage that's really needed to have quality habitat, to have a viable huntable population, either with your land or maybe in combination with your neighbors. So what scale are we talking about? And Michael, I'll just go ahead and start with you.
Like we discussed earlier, a lot of it's going to depend on your location and what your neighbors are doing. But for a standalone property out in the middle of nowhere with nothing else going on around it, you're going to need a sizable chunk of land to have a huntable population for yourself. We're talking around 1,000, 1,500 acres. It can be done with a little bit of smaller acreages, but it's tough. Now, with that being said, a lot of it goes into what you're expecting. I mean, if you're looking to have 2 or 3 covey finds an hour, that's what it's going to take. Now, if you're talking about once a year, once every other, month, you can certainly do a lot with smaller properties. And like I say, it goes to that connectivity issue that we've been talking about too. So getting your neighbors on board goes a long way.
Hey, TJ, did you have anything you wanted to add to that?
No, I mean, I think Michael's estimate is right on. I was just thinking of some recent papers I read that to have a viable standalone quail population or a viable quail population, you need about 800 individuals for the long-term health of the population to be sustainable because of the genetics. And so you figure 800 birds, you're going to need upward of 1,000. If everything was picture perfect and ideal, you might be able to do it a little bit less than that, but that's probably not going to be the case. But you need to be shooting for a population of about 800 birds on your property or adjoining property.
Breck, did you have anything else?
No, I don't think so. We've mentioned it so many times already. The landscape context is so important for Bobwhites. And so, if you've got 100 acres in South Georgia and you're surrounded by big quail plantations, then you have enough. But most people don't have that. So it's really dependent on what's going on around you and making sure your management's at a landscape level and not, on small scale as much as possible.
Okay. And Cory, I'm going to kind of switch questions here midstream. So we talked a little bit about property size. How about the best burn block sizes? Do you have any recommendations on not only timing of fire, but also the size or how it's applied on the landscape?
How many days do I have to answer this question? We're going to get like a week for this. My opinion, and I'm sure it's going to vary from some of the other panelists, but my opinion is make your burn blocks as small as possible. And my reasoning behind that, the more burn blocks I have, the more I can vary the timing and frequency of those fires, and the more variation I can have in habitat, the greater the diversity I'm going to have. You know, here in Columbia, where we're doing some of this work just as a demonstration area, I'm doing my best to keep everything to a ½ acre to an acre block size. Is that practical on a 2,000 acre plantation? No, and I understand that. So make them as small as you can make them and still be practical for what you're managing. You know, but I would do my best in any of these places to keep them 20 acres or less. I would, you know, try to strive for that 5 to 10 acre range on most properties. And again, the more blocks you have, the more you can vary that timing and frequency of that fire. As for my preferred time, I don't have one. I think it's important that we're burning in the dormant season. I think it's important that we burn in the growing season. And I think we need to mix that up within those seasons, you know, maybe have some October, November burns and some December, January burns and some February, March burns mixed with the same thing throughout the growing season. So they're not all happening at the same time. I think that's really important. Mix it up.
Yeah, I agree. I think those are great points. Andy, do you have anything you wanted to add to that?
Well, just you mentioned the intensity and you know, don't like vary that also. I mean, sometimes you need to have a hotter fire, but ideally, you know, a patchier burn creates a lot of diversity. It creates, you know, unburned and burned areas and creates cover right next to, you know, good brood habitat. So ideally, you know, a less intense fire is better for quail management.
Breck, you have any more thoughts on that?
Yeah, shape of your burn blocks is important too. If you've got, you know, long, narrow burn units, then you can make them a little bigger because then birds don't have as far to travel to get to unburned habitat. What you have to realize when you're burning for quail, whatever you burn this year is pretty much going to be knocked out of nesting habitat for this year. So you need to make sure there's unburned habitat close by. That's why we like the small burn blocks that, you know, some get burned, some don't. So again, it's all about minimizing movement of quail as much as possible.
All right. TJ, anything else you wanted to add to Breck's comments?
No, but referring back to, well, yes, I do. Referring back to his earlier comment about interspersion of habitat, the small burn blocks, if you can have them in somewhat of a checkerboard pattern across your landscape, that habitat variability is going to benefit the quail because there'll be a number of different resources available to them without them having to move, as Breck said. As far as the timing of the burn, I agree with Cory. It really depends on what your objectives are for that particular burn block. If you've got a lot of sweet gum, woody vegetation that needs controlled, I would shoot for a growing season burn, you know, either in April or after the buds have broken on the plants, or later in the year before the plants shut down. But studies have shown for wildlife in general that a variety of burning seasons is really good because fire occurred historically at different times of the year, and different plants respond to different seasonality of fire in terms of their ability to set seed and flower and set seed. But so it's one of the standard extension answers. It depends. It depends on the situation.
Okay. And Michael, any last words?
Yeah, you know, one thing that we often give a recommendation on is the return interval. We usually tell folks to shoot for a 2-year return interval. You know, it really gets at good quail habitat. It's not exactly great for other species of wildlife. I mean, it's not ideal for turkeys. You know, you can go longer. For turkeys, you can go even longer than that for deer. But we tell folks for quail, you got to be on 2 years. And we understand that you're not going to get all of them on 2 years. And occasionally they get pushed to 3 years. So like I said, we usually shoot for that 2-year goal. And something to consider that, you know, when you burn, whatever you've just burnt this spring, that's brood habitat for the chicks. What you've left in the past is nesting habitat. What gets left longer than that is escape cover. So, and you know, if you're doing it right and you've got small burn blocks, that there's nothing wrong with burning in the fall and all. Just remember that you're taking habitat off at the time when birds are going to need it the most, and it's not going to return back till the following spring. But like I say, you know, if you got a stand that's choked up with sweet gums and you're burning on small blocks, I'd rather burn that sweet gum any day than let it go another year without fire. So.
Yeah, definitely. So we talked a little bit about fire, and we have a question here from one of our participants about herbicides. And so their question is if it's okay to spray herbicide if the nesting season is about to start. So I'd love for you to talk just a little bit about maybe some considerations when using herbicides, maybe certain herbicides to select out certain species, and then also kind of impacts directly on quail and quail habitat. And Michael, I can just start with you.
I will say that they are an absolute necessity here in South Carolina. Like I say, you're going to be fighting things, and you need to use every tool in your toolbox, whether that's fire, that's herbicides, that's mastication, what have you. I think there's some other folks on here that's better to give recommendations than I can, though. So I'm going to let folks on down the line answer that.
All right, great. TJ, any thoughts on herbicide use?
I'll agree with Michael that it's, you know, you need an integrated pest management program. It does not have to be all herbicides, but it's hard to do it without any herbicides, especially for some species. As far as the timing of it, these herbicides are fairly safe. And I think maybe Cory can address that a little bit more too. Not meaning to throw it on him, but you know, when you look at the LD50s and all, these for birds and mammals, these herbicides are fairly safe. But you need to include that in your toolkit.
I can add to what TJ was just saying there a little bit. One of the things I'd point out, if you're in quality nesting habitat, then herbicides shouldn't really be an issue, because if we're in good quality nesting habitat, we don't have a whole lot of woody stems out there that we're having to deal with. So that might be one thing to look at, and that goes back to what I said the very first point in this whole talk was evaluating what you have. But if it is high quality nesting habitat, then there's not going to be a whole lot of woody stems that need to be controlled there. Simple as that. Later on down the road, there will be. As far as the safety of the herbicides used for bird nesting, TJ's spot on. We have extremely low risk for birds with the products that we're using on the forestry side. In fact, you could directly spray the nest, and I doubt you'd have any impact whatsoever on the nest. But keep in mind, herbicides are critical to what we're trying to do. And, you know, I'm sure some would disagree with me, but I don't think we can manage quail in South Carolina without the use of herbicides. I don't think that we can do it long term. So they're definitely something that we're going to have to incorporate into our management.
And Lisa,
Breck
I would
or
just like
Andy, go ahead. Yeah.
I'd just like to add that a lot of these herbicides are more effective in the fall anyway, outside the nesting season. Hardwood control, some pasture control and pasture grasses, anything like that it's better to hit those hardwoods or those pasture grasses right before they shut down for the year, because they take that chemical into their roots and get a more effective kill.
Great. Breck, any last words?
I would just say be pretty targeted when you use herbicides. You don't want to, you know, use a lot of tank mixes usually, where you have several different formulations all mixed together, and then you throw a little glyphosate or Roundup on top of that just for good measure, because you're really not aiming for total vegetation control. So know what it is you're trying to control and use the correct herbicide for that.
Great. Great. So we had a couple questions that were sent in about regional differences in quail. There was a question about how difficult it will be to restore quail in the mountain areas, Pickens, Oconee, and Greenville counties. So maybe you can speak to kind of any regional differences in management or recovery. And then also, you know, just the overall goal for restoring quail populations here in South Carolina. And Breck, I'll just go ahead and start with you.
Okay, well, I don't know how many of the folks that are on the call today have seen our state quail restoration plan, but there's a map in there that was developed early on to identify the best geographic areas for quail habitat restoration in South Carolina. And if you look at that map, you'll notice that the very best areas are kind of a band of kind of upper coastal plain habitat with a little bit in the Piedmont. And that's based on a number of factors, you know, current land use, predicted future land use, soil types, that kind of thing. Having said that, you know, virtually everywhere in South Carolina, quail could be restored on if you're willing to do enough work on a big enough area. Again, it goes back to landscape level management. You know, I think one of the questions had to do with bringing quail back in the mountainous counties, which there's still some quail hanging on up there. So if you can get enough acreage, you know, tied together up there, it's totally possible to do it.
Michael, do you want to jump in?
Sure. Along those lines, specifically talking about those mountainous areas, you know, historically the birds were there. It's like a lot of places across the state that, you know, the forests up there have aged to a point where they're just not conducive to birds. The agriculture that used to be up there is just not there anymore and it's turned to forest. You know, used to have wildfires up there that we don't have. So with all that being said, you can do some bird work up there and the birds do return. The U.S. Forest Service has, within the last 5 years, really increased their burden on the Andrew Pickens, their portion of the national forest up there. The state park is increased their burning up there since the Pinnacle Mountain fire. You know, the Forest Service has been doing a bunch of thinning, both in, they're getting rid of a bunch of off-target pine species that were planted 40, 50, 60 years ago. But they're doing a lot of mixed oak hickory work as well, thinning those areas down. And it's creating a lot of good bird work habitat. And, you know, like I say, we're seeing a bunch of non-game birds show up there that, you know, hadn't been seen in a while. We're starting to see the bobwhites show up in those areas. Starting to find a few grouse here or there where they're doing it at a high enough elevation. So long story short, if you do the work, it doesn't matter where you're doing it in South Carolina, those birds will show up.
Cory, Andy, or TJ, anything else you wanted to add to that?
Just real simply, it's going to become a major issue in some of these highly developed areas to cooperate at community levels. So have your neighborhood develop some type of plan for how they're going to use that green space to benefit birds instead of being well manicured lawns, how to tie your neighborhood into the next neighborhood and the next neighborhood. And as we continue developing all these areas, if you ride through Greenville or Pickens today and you look at what's not developed in housing developments, it's pretty much mature hardwoods, which is definitely not quail habitat. So it's going to take some pretty extensive work up there, in my opinion, to really see a difference in the quail population. But habitat, it's as simple as that. And human development, it can work together with quail, you know, but we got to change what we think's pretty, and that well manicured lawn that everybody's striving for is dang sure not going to help the quail population.
Mm-hmm. Andy or TJ, anything else you wanted to add to that?
I'll just echo what Cory said. I mean, we haven't really gotten into it yet, but the reason that quail have declined so much is the loss of nesting and brood rearing habitat. And if we continue to have more and more areas put into housing developments and converted for other purposes, then it's difficult to get that back. But my son creeping in here. But no, that's the biggest threat to the birds, is the loss of that habitat.
And I can't speak on the upstate, but I can speak on what Cory said, that definitely, you know, the idea of what pretty should look like should be changed in most people's minds if you want to have wildlife as your focus. So
Great. Let's see. So we have a question from Van Pittman. Can you talk about disking? What season and how much is too much disking? Michael, I guess we can just start with you.
Winter disc. It is one of the best tools a quail manager has is disking in the wintertime. You know, we typically tell folks November, December, January, early February, that's the time to be dropping a disc. You know, hey, if you've got fallow fields that you need to take care of but can't burn, disking's a good option. You know, depending on their size, you can break them up into half or thirds and do one half this year, one half next year. You know, if they're smaller fields, do the whole thing, and hopefully you've got another small field, you know, disking along roadsides, random disking out through open pine stands. You know, it's a great management tool. And one thing I'll tell folks is, you know, take good notes. Write down when you go disc in the wintertime, write what the date was, and then go back and look and see what comes up. Varying the time in the disking really produces different things. And everybody's property is different. You know, I can disc in November and come up with something completely different than Breck, who discs on the same day. And like I say, it's just what's available in the seed bank.
Great, thank you. Are there considerations, maybe the next panelist can answer this, if you have invasive species or Bermuda or Bahia when you're disking? I didn't know if there was any kind of things that landowners should be doing or thinking about when they're disking with some of those undesirables present. Let's see, I'll just go to TJ next.
So the question is, are there considerations or reasons maybe that you wouldn't want to disc those areas that have Bermuda and Bahia? No, I can't think of any reason to avoid disking them, but you're not going to control it just with disking unless you aggressively disc repeatedly, and but it's going to require herbicides in those areas. If that was the question, I can't think of any reason to avoid disking them to control other vegetation that you want to control, but don't expect good results from just disking alone to get rid of those turf grasses.
Great. Breck, how about you? Any thoughts on disking, timing?
The timing is really the key there. The reason we recommend winter disking is that usually brings the types of plants that we want in good quail habitat, your ragweeds, your partridge peas, your beggar weeds, a number of different wildflowers. You shift that timing into the spring or summer, you tend to get more plants you don't want, like noxious weeds. If the site has any agriculture history, there's more than likely going to be coffee weed seed there and those kinds of things that you don't want. So that timing in the winter months is really critical. And I'll also say you don't need to disc the area clean like you're going to plant a garden or a crop. Just, you know, top 2 or 3 inches of the soil is all that needs to be disturbed. And that'll generally bring about a plant response.
Yeah, that's a great comment. Cory, anything else?
Yeah, one thing I can add there, and I really wish I'd taken the time and put some slides together to show you this, because I got some really good pictures to demonstrate. But if we're disking for quail, when I get through disking, 99% of the time from a distance, you can't tell I disced that field. And if you're doing it right, you shouldn't be able to tell. It shouldn't be bare dirt out there when you disc that field. And if you're going that far, you're doing way too much. Lightly lightly, like Breck said, 1 to 3 inches max. Just scratch the top of it and roll on. We're not trying to clean till anything. And you also don't want to do deep tillage because you run into issues with your chicks there as well. If you get out in that field and you disc it deeply, you're going to kick up stuff that's 6, 8, 10 inches tall, and you're basically creating channels that bobwhite chicks can't get through anyway. You know, they're not that maneuverable when they're young. So lightly disking.
Yeah, that's a great point. Andy, anything else you want to wrap up this question?
Just that, like, we should, just like fire, we should worry about adjacency. Disking in strips, long and linear, works a lot better, and have adjacent, you know, disc this strip this year, next strip next year, you know, disc a different strip, and then the third year disc another one. That way you have a variety of habitats, variety of uses. You have, you know, that first year you have a lot of brood cover, and the second year you have some nesting, and then finally in that third year you usually have some escape cover. So.
Great, thank you. So we had a question sent in about predators. And the question is that how big of an impact do they really have on quail populations, particularly coyotes and fire ants? And can you talk a little bit about the importance of predator control? And Andy, I can just start with you.
You know, it's something we need to worry about, but it's somewhere down the line. We need to get all of our habitat in the correct shape first, because the habitat is going to act like a deterrent for those predators to begin with. If we have good cover, you know, the hawks the quail have somewhere to go if there's cover. And we'd like that evenly spaced throughout our whole property. Ideally, not more than 50 yards apart. You have, you know, clumps of cover throughout the landscape. And that's going to cut down a lot of your predation. But when we do finally get all of that habitat in good shape, we can start trapping, and things that we want to concentrate on are nest predators. A lot of the nest predators we can't do anything about. Snakes, non-venomous snakes, they cause about 40% of the predation, and you can't really do anything about them. But the other things that we can concentrate on are possums, coons, armadillos, skunks, fox, that we can control, but that comes in, like I said, way far down the line. And, you know, for most landowners on a small scale, it's not going to have that much effect. Now we talk about big quail plantations, 2,000 acres, we can have quite a bit of effect. You can get a 15 to 20% increase in year-to-year production. But like I said, it has to be a landscape level. It can't be small here and there. And also the timing of that trapping is also important. We don't trap right before nesting season. Those predators fill a void that so fast that it's pretty much useless if I trapped in December. So.
Okay. Cory, did you have anything you wanted to add to that?
Well, mainly just seconding what Andy said. And I agree that it is more important depending on the size of the property you have. But I think overall, the general thing that I hear coming through day to day is exactly what we heard in this question: coyotes and fire ants. Mm-hmm. And in the grand scheme of things, those are the least two species for us to be concerned with. Coyotes, I'm not familiar with any study that clearly defines coyotes as a major issue for bobwhites. I'm not telling you there's not one out there, but I've yet to read it. What I will tell you though, raccoons decimate turkey nest, raccoons decimate bobwhite quail nest. In my personal opinion, if you're managing quail, you need to focus on those. That needs to be a part of it. Is it absolutely required? No. No. If you got excellent habitat, you should be able to produce enough quail chicks every year to make up for that loss. But if you're trying to do everything to the best of your abilities, then making sure you have excellent escape cover, excellent brood rearing cover, excellent nesting cover, and predator control, that's doing everything to the best of your ability.
That's great. Great comments. Great thoughts. Breck, do you have anything else you wanted to add?
Not really. Just emphasize what Cory just said. You know, you got to have the habitat first, or the trapping's really not going to accomplish a whole lot. And then, as Andy said, the timing is important too. It's got got to be right ahead of nesting season because these predators are extremely resilient. You can trap all the raccoons off of a farm in January, and by July, you're gonna have just as many back on the farm.
Yeah, it's definitely a lot of effort put in. TJ or Michael, any last words on this?
I will echo sort of what Cory was getting at with the coyotes and the fire ants. Coyotes may end up being sort of helpful for bobwhites. They're going to be concentrating on your nest predators. They're going to make a meal out of the other animals that are eating nest predators. I mean, that they'll eat the nest predators. So they're not a serious threat to the bobwhite. Sure, they'll take one every now and then, but that's a lot of work for the coyote for a little meal. And as far as fire ants go, it was purely coincidental that we hit the decline pretty good in the 80s when we really got fire ants here in South Carolina. I mean, you can look at other states like Virginia. They didn't get fire ants till 2007. They experienced the same decline we did. States like New Jersey, I'm not even sure that they have fire ants yet, and they've experienced the same decline. It's just, sure, a fire ant will take over a nest on a hot, dry day. More often than not, fire ants are food for the bobwhite chicks when they first come out. So, on Tall Timber says it's about 3 to 5% predation from fire ants. So, the overall, that's not a big percentage for bobwhite chicks.
Yeah, that's a great comparison to have, kind of looking at different states. Let me see if I can grab another question out of the chat box. Let's see. For those of us landowners that are growing pines, especially loblolly, what are some things that we can do in our pine plantations to encourage bobwhites? I know burning helps, wide fire breaks, but are there any other things that landowners need to think about?
I can go ahead and start with one
Sure.
simple thing. Actively manage your pine stands. Don't put off thinning. I mean, if you're growing trees for a crop, it's pretty tempting to say, well, I'll wait another year to wait for the timber prices to get better. And more often than not, you'll benefit both your wildlife and your pocketbook by go ahead and doing those regular thin or scheduled thins. Like I say, it goes a long way just doing that.
TJ, anything else you wanted to add?
No, Michael was right on with that. Burning in those woods is not going to accomplish a whole lot unless you also open up that canopy by thinning. You need about at least 50% sunlight hitting that forest floor to support the ground cover species, the native grasses, the legumes, and other things that are going to be beneficial for quail. So you can burn these real dense pine plantations, but unless you get in there and thin to keep that canopy open over time, you're not going to get the habitat underneath the pines that you're desiring.
How about you, Breck?
Yeah, a couple other things you could do. The thinning's got to come first, of course, but winter strip disking in those areas after you've gotten them opened up is beneficial. Taking areas like the old logging decks and clearing them up and turning them into good high quality brood habitat is beneficial. Wide fire breaks were mentioned. That's what we always want in quail management is wide fire breaks that you really can get them unless the terrain is too steep. You can get them to a point where you can just do them with a farm tractor and a disc as opposed to having to have heavier equipment. So all of those will help, but the thinning is, number one.
Yeah. Cory or Andy, any last thoughts?
So I'm just echoing. Go ahead, Cory.
I'm just going to say it's all about sunlight. The earlier you can open that canopy, the better off you'll be. Daylighting those roads and getting sun to the road. It depends on how important the revenue is to you, but there's nothing wrong with sacrificing a few rows here and there to to create a little opening long before it was ready for commercial sale. But if quail is the main objective, daylight is the answer, and getting that sunlight to the ground in a pine stand. Sorry for jumping into you, Andy. Go ahead.
So good. Just to echo what everybody said, you know, thinning to the 40 basal area or lower is very important. If you can't get that done, but you have good areas throughout your property that are below, that don't have tree canopy or have a low tree canopy, you can connect those with those daylighting of roads and creating roadside areas that allow quail to move through your property and kind of connect that good habitat.
So we've got about 3 minutes left. And so I wanted to end up talking a little bit about cost share opportunities. I know as someone who works with landowners quite a bit, it's something I'm asked about all the time. And so the Longleaf Alliance, we've got a number of different cost share programs, but maybe Andy, you might be able to answer this question just about other types of cost share opportunities through NRCS or some of the other programs that are out there that landowners could take advantage of.
Well, I work mainly with USDA programs. There's two sides of USDA that I work with, NRCS and FSA. FSA's main program is CRP. If you have any kind of land that's actively farmed or actively grazed, it's eligible to be put in the CRP. CRP is a 10 to 15 year program where they pay you annual rental rates along with some incentive payments. If you're interested in doing a one-time deal and not having to worry about a long-term event, the EQIP program available through NRCS. It's you know what I work with the most. It allows landowners incentive payments to thin, burn, use some timber stand improvement. Then there's also another program, CSP, that's in between those two programs. It's a 5-year commitment, and it allows someone to get kind of like on a burning rotation, maybe do 2 or 3 burns within that contract and get paid for it. But in general, we can, if you're interested in doing something that benefits wildlife, we can find a program that fits your needs. If you contact, say, Lisa or myself or a couple other biologists in the area, we can usually find something for the landowner that works for them, fills their needs.
Thank you. Well, we're just about out of time. I'm going to pull up my last slide here and give Parker a chance to put our evaluation into the chat box. It would be really helpful, again, if you all filled that out. Let's see here. All right. It helps us figure out what kind of programs everybody would like to see going forward. If you've got questions that didn't get answered in the chat or that kind of come to you later, feel free to email me and I'll try to get those answered, lisa@longleafalliance.org. Thank you to our panelists who took the time to be here today. I know you all are busy people. I also wanted to acknowledge them from DNR and Clemson and the Bobwhite Quail Initiative, and then also our funders here for helping to sponsor this. And I think that's about it, and we'll stay on here so that you all can get that evaluation link and click. So thank you all very much.